Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Indonesia Study Group session. My name is Eve Warburton. It's a real pleasure to be chairing the session today with our very special guest, all the way from Sydney, Dr. Leon Sinclair. Before I begin, I'd like to first just acknowledge that today we're meeting on the traditional and unceded lands of the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So as I said, very special guest, Dr. Leon Sinclair has come all the way from Sydney. Leon is based there as a postdoc research associate at the School of Geosciences at the University of Sydney. And Leon is going to be presenting their book project, or not book project, actually, recently published book with the University of Manchester Press. And it's based on Leon's doctoral research conducted a few years ago now, well, you know, we know how it works. We know how it works. Leon received the PhD from Murdoch University, from the Asia Research Centre there in 2020. And since completing the PhD and publishing the book, Leon has also been working not just on Indonesia, in fact, but on mining and extractive industries in Australia and Southeast Asia more broadly. So I'm really excited to hear about Leon's book. It's rare that we have a really sort of deep dive social science examination of Indonesia's extractive industries. But Leon, as I said, also has really wide knowledge of this discipline, not just in Indonesia. So it's going to be a really fantastic presentation. Bit of housekeeping, 45 minutes of presentation, 45 minutes of Q&A as usual. It's a hybrid session, so we're online as well as in person. In the Q&A, I'll take questions from the audience here. But then we'll also take some online. So if you are listening online, please put your questions in the chat. Is that right? Because we cannot hear you and will not hear you.
In the question and answer.
Oh, sorry, in the question and answer. Thank you very much. And that's all I have to say. So I'll welcome Leon up to the microphone. Cool.
Thanks, Eve. Thanks so much for the invite to come here. It's a real pleasure to be here at the ANU speaking with the Indonesia Study Group, the Indonesia project. Yeah, really excited. And thanks for chairing the session. And yeah, it's actually been really good to think about what is it out of my book that would be most interesting for this audience, for the sort of more ANU audience. So it's been really interesting to dive back into some of that material that I haven't thought about for a little while. But yes, yeah, like, I mean, you already introduced me so well. Like you said, I guess the one thing that I'll add is I am a bit cautious coming here because I'm not an Indonesianist. Although I wrote my book and my thesis about politics and the resource industry in Indonesia, I never was trying to be a sort of broad expert in Indonesian politics. So please excuse me if I can't, end up keeping up with some of the sort of most recent developments and happenings across Indonesian politics. Thanks. Yeah, and since finishing my PhD, my work has been really focused on Australia, mining industries in Australia, particularly critical minerals, and how critical minerals in Australia plug into global production networks. Of course, there are some really interesting intersections with Indonesian nickel, which we'll come to at the sort of end of today. But yeah, mostly my work recently has focused much more on Australia. So before getting any further into it, I also would like to acknowledge the First Nations people, the Ngunnawal people of the land on which we meet today. I'd also like to acknowledge Nunga Wajak Buja, the land where I grew up, and where these beautiful Nolak are from. I miss that country. It's an incredibly beautiful country, which is the work where a lot of the writing up this material took place. I also want to extend that acknowledgement to Indigenous peoples throughout Indonesia, particularly the Bahau Dayak people and the Isam Pagu people of Tebelo region, where some of my case studies were conducted, and who some people from those communities I get to know well over my time there. And also extend that acknowledgement to Indigenous and First Nations people worldwide, because the original custodians of lands are often those that bear the brunt of the negative impacts of extractive industries while receiving less benefits from them. So, and I think it's always important to start with that kind of acknowledgement of how the extractive industries, and when we work on extractive industries, how those impacts affect First Nations people. So my book covers a lot of ground. It covers ground. I talk about crises of legitimacy that led to new global governance regimes. There's 3 really detailed case studies of resistances and contestations in different places in Indonesia. I mentioned 2 of those already. But for this talk, like I said, I wanted to focus on something that I thought would be much more interesting for you all, and also something that's that was inspired by reading some of your early work, Eve, and your recent book is recent book, still recent, is also fantastic and continues to actually to inspire me. So hopefully this also engages, and we have some good opportunity to talk about resource nationalism and things as well. So I've tried to bring some of that in. And I'll start by talking about a scalar problem, which is going back to the very first problem I found in 2015 when I started reading about resource politics in Indonesia. And that's probably we end up with very different results when if we look at national scale resource politics versus local scale resource politics. I'll get into that. Then I talk about sort of the theoretical framework. Indulge me in my Marxism for a little bit, where I talk about extractivism and extractive accumulation. And I'll demonstrate what that means by talking about the specific example of Rio Tinto's Kelian mine in East Kalimantan. And I'll talk about a little bit of my view about what that contested extractivism looks like throughout Indonesian history, with a specific focus on resource nationalism and the exit of Western multinational mining companies from Indonesia in the 2010s, really. And then, I'll finish off with a few comments about nickel, because I think that's probably what is on the top of everyone's mind when we talk about resource politics right now in Indonesia. And I want to make I want to just kind of outline a few broad arguments today that I think both ANU, but scholars from ANU and also scholars from Murdoch, where I studied, miss a couple of things that I think would be really interesting to explore and think about a bit further, and also really open to being corrected if you think I'm wrong and I've missed some really important scholars from here. But I think because both ANU and Murdoch schools of Indonesian politics really emphasize domestic factors, and particularly domestic factors at the national level for explaining political and economic developments in Indonesia. But I think there are 3 things that we often overlook. And one is that multi-scalar contestation. So from local, provincial, national, and global, international and global scales, different contestations that play out in different ways. Firm strategy, and I'll get particularly into some sort of multinational firm strategy, and then also the role of subaltern resistance, or the resistance of, in this case, people affected by mining industries as a generative force in creating crisis and creating new, creating the impetus for new political arrangements, new political settlements to emerge. So starting off with this scale-up problem, like I said, back in 2015 when I first started, so forgive me if I'm a little bit rusty on this because it was a while ago that first sort of identified this problem, but I was reading about resource politics in Indonesia and broadly identified 2, not just Indonesia, but globally as well, but broadly identified 2 different literatures that result in different conclusions. The first, resource nationalism, and Eve being the best, most sophisticated development of this approach, looks at the conflict between corporations, different types of businesses, and the state, and contestations over the spoils, over the profits of the mining industry and ownership. right? It's, I think, from there's different versions of this, but there's the more economic version, there's the more institutionalist version, there's the more political economy-based version of these approaches. But broadly, more or less, they focus on national scale and comparative politics, comparing different results across different countries, right? But it's a national scale-based approach. And the conclusions broadly are about how effectively states can assert rights and control over natural resources, I should say. And of course, in Indonesia, that's much more successful than it has been in other places like, Mexico, Argentina, South America, basically, who now look to Indonesia as a model for how can they, be more successful in their resource nationalist endeavors. And there may be reasons for suspecting that Indonesia is unique or isn't unique. That's an interesting conversation I think we could get into. But we come up with this conclusion that there are these really strong developmental states, particularly in a place like Indonesia. The Indonesian state apparatus is able to expropriate some of the largest and most powerful multinational corporations in the world, right? And that's true. I'm not disputing that at all. It's true. But on the other hand, we have this other body of work that looks at local politics that starts from the point of examining corporate and community or corporate versus community conflict at the local scale around mine sites, right? It's sort of dominated by post-structuralists, anthropologists. Some of the best examples are one of my favorite books that fits into this category is Marina Welker's Enacting the Corporation, which again I read in about 2015 or 16, whenever that came out. But also you have people, I don't know, down to Bapriadi, other interesting people who write about human rights at that local scale. This literature correctly examines the way that multinational corporations have been taking over more and more of the social and environmental management of the conflicts that occur. So it sees actually, and again, correctly identifies that there's been this kind of a withdrawal of the state becoming much less involved in in community development work, in environmental monitoring and management, and corporations taking over more and more of those functions. And so therefore says, actually there's a very neoliberal state. The state is withdrawing, it's retreating, states are very weak, states are being bullied by multinational corporations, states are unable to stand up for the rights of workers, fishers, farmers, indigenous people, so on. There's echoes in this about about the sort of hyper-globalist and skeptic debate in international relations that we could draw some of that out a little bit more as well. So yeah, how can we sort of hold these two literatures, which both are true, both have really interesting results, but how can we resolve this apparent contradiction or contestation? Or if you think that actually there's no real significant contradiction here, then feel free to tell me as well. Before answering that question directly, though, I want to take a step back and think about what is distinctive about extractive industries in capitalist societies, right? Firstly, thinking this through, is I came up with a few things that I think makes extractive capitalism quite different from industrial capitalism, finance capitalism, other sectors, right? First is the centrality of primitive accumulation and land grabbing, right? Of course, resource politics are the politics of land are baked in as central. Land must be grabbed, there must be a transfer of ownership of land in order for resources to be extracted, right? Which means that whoever was using that land before the mining company came along needs to be dispossessed, right? Needs to be moved on in some way. That's moving people on from their land, that land grab, that transformation in the function of land results in a rapid change to whatever pre-existing social relations, whatever pre-existing social and economic function that land performed, right? Be it agriculture, be it small-scale mining, be it different types of ecosystems or wilderness, quote unquote, or indigenous peoples' lands, which has dramatic effects and creates, again, rapid change in people's relationships of production and social reproduction. Right? In this sense, and this is probably where some other Marxists might take issue with this part of my argument, but the primary relation in extractive capitalism then is not one between capital and labor, but is actually one between the corporation and the communities. Right. It's my contention. The main value of extractive industries does not come from extracting the surplus labor of their workforce, but comes from literally extracting the resources that sit beneath the land. And therefore, the primary relationship or the primary risk that corporations, states, whoever's doing that extracting, whatever the primary tension that needs to be managed is how can they manage relationships with that local community that has grievances, that has been dispossessed, so as recalcitrant populations are not reproduced, so as the local populations are not basically rising up in resistance and blockading and protesting and getting organized and making friends internationally and so on and so forth, right? Like so instead of it's about how you create, construct and control a workforce, it's how you create, construct and control the communities around your mind that might disrupt you. And there's many ways to do that, right? Violent, non-violent, legal, illegal, many different ways to do that. Let me just take some water. So, okay, this is in the wrong order, but anyway. So the critical political economy proposition around this is usually framed in terms of extractivism, right? And here I have a quote from Tana Mentan, excellent African scholar, Veins of Africa. Extractivism is a form of internal colonialism managed by elites of the former colonies operating under the structural power of supranational institutions like the World Trade Organization, World Bank, IMF, so on and so forth. He places less emphasis than, probably more famous than Menton is Veltmeyer and Petras, who write about neo-extractivisms and talk about the role of multinational corporations as sort of the primary enactors of neo-imperialism via extractive politics, and also talks about in neo-extractivism you have the extractivist politics in particularly Latin American states funding their large social programs, right? So, but again, this idea of extractivism and the theories of extractivism and most existing work, not all, most existing work on extractivism focuses on that national scale politic between multinational corporations, state actors, and the global scale, right? Because, well, it's within a global context of global capitalism, imperialism, and so on and so forth. But mainly the main scale of analysis remains stuck at that national level. So I needed an approach or an amalgamation of different approaches that was able to overcome this scalar divide. And so the term that I coin in the book is extractive accumulation. Which I define as the collection of strategies and relationships across local, national, and global scales that enable corporations to first secure access to land, so to do the land grab, to do the primitive accumulation, but then to continue to profit from the extraction of minerals or indeed many other types of commodities within capitalist economies, and that involves, like I hinted at already, the management of potentially recalcitrant populations by supervising and creating new forms of social reproduction that are not threatening to processes of extraction and capital accumulation. Okay. Is that enough Marxist theory for the minute? Okay, cool. Right, Leon, this is great, great abstract, really, yeah. But what does this actually look like in practice? What does this actually mean? I'm sure is the question. That's at the top of everyone's minds. Maybe you've got some other questions, I don't know. But so the book goes through what that looks like in three case studies. One of which is the Kellyan mine upriver Mahakam in East Kalimantan. And that's the one I want to talk about a little bit today. I'm going to attempt to do it quickly. We'll see how we go. But two other cases that demonstrate similar things in different ways. But the Kellyan case it's a critical or a crucial case. It's probably more significant as a global case than it is within Indonesian politics, because it's at the time, because this is occurring around the turn of the millennium when organizations like the World Bank, when International Council on Mining and Metals are being formed, when the new global governance regime of mining industries is being formed in order to head off various crises of legitimacy. So it's a globally significant case. But I don't see it mentioned that often in Indonesian politics. So let's go through it a little bit. The photo here, of course, is of the old mining pit, or the void, which is being filled. It's over, I can barely read the text there, but it's over 1 kilometre deep and filled with some beautiful looking water on a nice clear day in Kaltim. So the story of, this is a problem when I talk about case studies. You can go back. Where can we start? We can start in 1985. There were a whole range of small-scale gold miners that comprised of local Dayak people, but also people from all over Indonesia who had ended up there for whatever reason. What reasons do you go far up the Mahakam River? But there were small-scale gold miners panning for gold in the river, had their communities established and in more or less communal and family-based types of production. Anyway, Rio Tinto engineers arrived around 1985 and started doing surveys, started exploring. They found out that there was significant gold deposits there, and of course they wanted to exploit that gold. And by 1992, all of those small-scale miners, about 4,000 of them or so, had been evicted. And yeah, of course, in the 80s and 90s, Indonesia, those kinds of evictions were incredibly violent, incredibly horrific stories to go through and hold and hear. The evictions occurred by a collection of Rio Tinto hired security. Local provincial government provided security and police forces. The military is involved. So this involved like all major actors at the time, and were involved in evicting those small-scale miners. Of course, as people do when they've been dispossessed and when they have resentment and they feel they have a case to make, the people that had been evicted started organizing, started forming groups, and they formed a group, LKMTL. LKMTL is Lembaga Kesejahteraan Masyarakat Tambang dan Lingkungan, who were able to jump scales. They made friends, made contact, and started organizing. Well, initially they were just organizing protests and blockades around the mine site, right? And weren't getting very far because of the incredible repressive apparatus, military and police that existed there. But then they started making friends with groups like WALHI, with Community Aid Abroad, now Oxfam Australia, and with the CFMEU, right? Cutting a very long story short, they essentially were able to organize international tours. So some of the leaders of LKMTL at the invitation and funding of the CFMEU, who at that time was locked in a bitter industrial relations battle with Rio Tinto over restructuring of individual contracts in Australia, so very much connected to politics here as well. We went to Melbourne. And they camped out the front of the Rio Tinto CEO's house in Toorak, right? And so they were taking the struggle home, right? And essentially at that time, because Rio Tinto's like, well, we're fighting the unions. We want to smash the CFMEU. We want we want individual contracts in our mines, in our coal mines in Australia. So we don't want these, we don't want Indigenous people from Indonesia siding with the unions here. We have to separate them. We have to break up this alliance because having these people talking about the human rights abuses that have occurred in Indonesia is making Rio Tinto look like the bad guy, right? So Rio Tinto officers in Melbourne ordered the Indonesian subsidiary to negotiate with LKMTL over compensation for human rights abuses, right? They didn't really want to do that, so then they went to London, right? Went to London in May 1998. Actually at the one of the leaders returned the day after Puncak Reformasi was going on. So Indonesian politics is in upheaval. At the same time, the Rio Tinto London office, so the global headquarters of Rio Tinto, had the same reaction as the Melbourne office did. They ordered the Indonesian subsidiary of Rio Tinto to negotiate with the local activists, and also with Walhi and Jakam, who had become involved by that stage as well. So they had support from national NGOs. Komnas HAM opened some investigations as well and uncovered credible evidence that some of the allegations may be true. I think I remember that phrase correctly. So they didn't prove that these human rights abuses definitively happened, but they recommended that the cases be taken up inside the formal justice system, which of course they never were. Rio Tinto ended up negotiating a total in the end of, well, I'm sorry, not a total in the end, of a package of $11.1 million Australian, which of course is loose change for Rio Tinto, and compared to some of the lasting traumas that had occurred there, that if I think too much about, I'll start to get really upset and angry. But there were some other there were more ongoing processes, and there were some other packages of compensation that were made as well. But anyway, then from 2001, 2003, Rio Tinto began collaborating with the World Bank on mine closure, on a participatory mine closure program. So instead of just doing what they wanted to do and telling communities, you have to accept that, they formed a committee so that the surrounding communities could have a say in what they wanted to see the mine site and the forest, indeed their traditional forest, where they had always been collecting forest products from, how they wanted to see that managed in perpetuity. Okay, so there's conflict, there's contestation, there's jumping scales, there's how the local and national and global scales start to impact each other. What about the other side that I was talking about managing the social reproduction of local populations, people affected by mining? At the same time as the 2001 negotiation, so simultaneously with that, Rio Tinto established several other participatory mechanisms. So there's community advice forums, there was a ranger program, there's I already mentioned the collaborative mine closure steering committee. But perhaps most significantly, their corporate community development programs and an agricultural school that they established there were a direct intervention into trying to convince the local populations, the Dayak people and other people who are living there as well, to practice more sedentary and plantation-based agriculture, particularly cocoa plantations was a big fad at the time, instead of the type of rubber plantations and shifting cultivation methods that had been used much more traditionally, because the shifting agricultural patterns, the shifting cultivation and fishing and collecting forest products often saw people quote unquote trespassing onto the mine lease land, and then therefore coming into conflict with security. So Rio Tinto wanted these participatory programs to create forms of social, rather than only policing. So they're still policing, there's still violence occurring to exclude trespassers, but they also wanted to create economic activities to create the types of social reproduction that didn't see people, trying to trespass or trying to fish in rivers where they're not allowed to fish, or indeed trying to pan for gold in the tailings dam, right? Which people tried to do. This, you probably can't read the text of this Rio Tinto Foundation poster, but there's a foundation that they established. It's a photo in the agricultural college that was established in one of the communities not far from the mine site. And one line in there, they use this cliche. Rio Tinto says that they don't want to teach the cliche that it's better to teach a man to fish than to just give him fish, right? Which always hits because those diet people are experts at fishing in their rivers, right? Those rivers which have been poisoned by cyanide and heavy metals, and the fish that they couldn't fish anymore, right? So it just, I don't know. Anyway, even when they're trying to do this participatory ethical capitalism thing, they're still saying these horrible phrases that cut deep. So yeah, the participation in those negotiations, I think the point to return to, I kind of hinted at this before, but the point is that those negotiations were successful in separating LKM. They were still in communication with Walhi and Jatam, and they were still involved from time to time, but it certainly separated them from the international campaign against Rio Tinto, which was from the CFMU, but also involving, continued to evolve and brought in the Longshore Workers Union across the west coast of the United States, right? So this campaign was growing, and it was successful in separating and dividing different groups from each other. But yeah, that's the point I just made. And this is a crucial case, like I said, in the global evolution of the participatory management of environmental and social impacts of mining, precisely because it is occurring at this time, because it's Rio Tinto who was leading some of the global initiatives, the global governance mechanisms, International Council on Mining and Metals being the first and most prominent of them. But around, the turn of the millennium, around 2000, 2001, 2003, the World Bank released its extractive industries review, and is going down the same path. Okay, cool. All right, let's get through the rest real quick. I don't know. I think maybe that sort of storytelling and story sharing is probably a bit more interesting to actually show you what it is I'm talking about anyway. All right, so if we take, all of these types of struggles are happening at many different mine sites, certainly at the 3 different sites that I looked at, and many others that I've heard and read about, I heard firsthand and or secondhand about. So if you aggregate that up to the national scale, you can see that there's what we can term the hegemonic bloc that consists more or less of the power of the presidency and ministries, the military, the police, the repressive apparatuses, domestic conglomerates, state-owned enterprises, and the multinational corporations and or other types of foreign capital. I argue that it's this hegemonic bloc that determines the character of regulation and approaches to resource politics at any given time, and that sort of the balance of forces within that bloc is constantly evolving and changing. There is a counter-hegemonic bloc, although that might be a bit too strong a term. It's certainly a lot more ephemeral than the hegemonic bloc, but again, it emerges from time to time and is able to exert power when there are coordinated actions at different times between Indigenous people, peasants, fishers, the national NGOs, in international alliance, right? Which, like in Rio Tinto, in that case, many other cases as well, has been successful in forcing crises, in precipitating crises, which force the hegemonic bloc to react, to change, to invent new mechanisms of governance and of control, of undermining resistance, right? I sort of go through in chapter 3, go through I use this as a heuristic. I'm not trying to create a new periodization of Indonesian history. Far from it. I'm just using these eras as a way of thinking about the way that that hegemonic coalition has changed over time, the different regulatory agendas that have existed as a result of that, and the different ways that people, both civil society and people affected by mining, have participated or have been able to participate at different times. So I want to focus a couple of other points before we finish up.
Back to the old.
Oh yeah, that's okay. I want to focus on the last two of those really quickly and talk about the Western multinational mining corporations that that exited from Indonesia, that sold out to domestic, be it private or state-owned enterprises, all through the 2010s. I know going back, if you track them, going back much before that, and that's excellent. But as a result of the resource nationalist measures. So yeah, BHP, I think this is one that I don't see mentioned very often either, is because this project never got built. But BHP sold its Indomet coal project, and it's worth pausing for a minute because at some times BHP was estimating that it was 1 trillion tons of coal across a few different concessions that spanned the border of South and East Kalimantan. And that, you know, they're going to start with annual production of 1 million tons and ramping up. But sold that to Adara in 2016. So BHP's no longer has a presence in Indonesia, or maybe just only a small corporate presence. Newmont, of course, I think, sorry to pick on you constantly, but you mentioned this in the very beginning of your book. And I think you're right to point out that this is an amazing turning point in ownership structures of mines in Indonesia, where where Western multinationals were selling to domestic private interests. Rio Tinto, of course, had sold its share of Grasberg in 2018, or its share of Freeport Indonesia in 2018, and had relinquished those all further interest in East Kalimantan, including the Kellyan case, from about 2006, depending on how you count the various subsidiaries and shell companies and things like that. Indo Mines sold their mining project to Rajawali Corp in 2018. That's a very small case. Probably no one's heard of it. That's fine, but it's one of the case studies in my book, so that's why I've included it there. That's on the south coast of Kulon Progo, Yogyakarta. Freeport, of course, we all know, is divested a majority of its shareholding to various state-owned enterprises. Newcrest sold its share of Gosowong gold mine, another one of the case studies in the book. In 2020. So as I was doing visions in the book, had to change everything to past tense. But that's, so, and Newcrest is now, of course, has been acquired by Newmont earlier this year. So that's now one entity. And then continuing on into the era of nickel, I read that Vale Indonesia is now not majority domestic owned, but the largest shareholder is the state-owned enterprise. And the Brazilians, of course, and Japanese still have roughly 30% each interest. So I think the only significant Western multinational corporation still operating is the French Eramet that has interest in Weda Bay. Could be wrong.
They've sold to Chinese companies.
They've sold out completely. So there we go.
Got a stake, but it's a minority stake.
Right, yeah, sorry, yeah, correct.
Shareholder.
Yeah, so they've still got, minority stake. Yeah, cool. Yeah, so they're still there, but so there's not much in terms of Western, depends how we count Western as well, multinational corporations above Indonesia. It's quite remarkable, and I think that, how much do I have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, cool, great. So I think that one of the pieces, I think that, the explanations of how the domestic political economy has driven the agenda of resource nationalism and driven the ability of domestic private and state-owned enterprises to acquire the largest and most technologically sophisticated mines in Indonesia are excellent. But I think the piece missing from that is a piece about understanding the strategies of those Western. mining companies. So looking at the global pressures, because around from that 2016 up until more recently, where commodity prices were depressed, so before this, the current mining boom in critical minerals, the strategies of Western multinationals, particularly the biggest ones, BHP, Rio Tinto, first amongst many, but also Newcrest, Newmont, both of those, their strategies was one of horizontal integration, not vertical integration. So that is, they want to, so of course, Rio Tinto, BHP, they want to continue to operate the duopoly of iron ore mining globally. And they want to own everything that they possibly can in terms of iron ore and profit off of the low unit cost and high volume production. So this didn't fit so well with Indonesia, and didn't fit so well particularly with the requirements to build out downstream processing. They weren't so interested, didn't fit with their expertise, didn't fit with their strategies to make profit, to create those downstream vertical integration. Also, of course, they wanted to avoid social conflict and decarbonize mining, which also didn't fit so well with building smelters in Indonesia. I can go more into that if there's questions about it. Of course, resource nationalism has been incredibly successful. You can see that the intermediate and refined metals has completely made up for the fall in oil and gas in terms of contribution to exports. I can tell you what those figures are precisely. But in terms of contribution to GDP, surprisingly, it's still just coal mining that is booming, which again is something I think we can all be incredibly concerned about. I can come back and talk more about resistance and the role of resistance as being a generative force if that's what we want to focus on. But I think that to come around, just finish off with a few points about nickel and why the downstreaming of nickel has been so successful in partnership with Chinese capital is because the Chinese firm strategy is almost opposite from the Western multinationals, from the largest Western multinationals, right? Like they want the vertical integration because they're more interested in securing supply than they are being profitable global businesses across single commodities, right? Also, I think there's arguments to be made about the overaccumulation of industrial assets in China itself and wanting to offshore and the sort of advanced processing technology that Chinese firms have, that Western multinationals are really struggling to implement. And we see this in Australia, let alone Western multinationals trying to invest in Indonesia. So the Chinese are just far ahead in terms of technological sophistication. So there's some really interesting questions that I would love to hear your opinions about, as well as about, can Indonesia simultaneously create supply chains that feed into China for Chinese nickel, but also into, a US IRA compliant or European Union compliant supply chain? I've heard arguments on both sides of that. But most interestingly, from my point of view, is what new social conflicts will emerge in this new era with omnibus law and new centralization of power? What new conflicts could emerge that could destabilize the hegemonic bloc that's formed now in partnership with Chinese capital? And then also interesting, how much further downstream can the nickel industry in Indonesia move? So a couple of slides from International Energy Agency showing that they're still predicting a shortfall of nickel production of up to 2040. But if we look at the nickel sulfate, which is the component that goes into batteries, lithium-ion batteries, it's far more dramatic. The shortfall of nickel sulfate, much more than nickel production or nickel ores. So there's room for everyone to keep downstreaming. Okay.
Bang on time.
Yeah,
Yes,
there we go.
Done. Yes. Thank you so much. There's a lot to dig in there, everyone. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. So I'll take a few in person now. Yeah, and then.
Thank you. See you guys.
Yes, Vinny, and maybe just introduce yourself to Leanne because she's not necessarily familiar with our crew here at ANU. Where am I going to
Oh,
say?
sorry.
Yeah, so I'm Vinny.
Yeah, thanks, and well, thanks,
Hi.
and welcome to Canberra.
Thank you.
Oh, you know each other. Okay, don't have to introduce.
Couple times.
Well, I just want to say congratulations on your book, and I'm
Thank
looking
you.
forward to that. Just want to go back to your hypothesis about for extractive capitalism. One of your hypotheses is that managing social production of the community, the host community,
Yeah.
is currently more important than the managing the workforce.
Yeah.
I guess looking and yes, I mean your case study was on Kerian, which was
Yeah.
mining company. But I think what I want to ask is whether this hypothesis is still relevant with the integrated nickel industrial park, in which, like what we face in Morowali and Weda Bay, for example, is a very huge, monstrous industrial park that employ more than 100,000 people. But then they live in the community, part of the community. So the managing that social order in order for capital investment to work is one of the most important things that companies have to do, right? So what I found in my research is actually managing this workforce that then become, entrenched into the community life is actually very important. They work together with the ethnic-based mass organizations like Angkatan Muda K, Maluku Pusat Rasa, and others ethnic-based mass organizations to really then fix that spatial enclave to be in order. So I think just looking into that, the difference between, yes, we used to face mining companies, but now we face something that is entirely different.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll respond to that real quick.
Yeah, sure.
100%. Correct, exactly. Because what I'm talking about here, and maybe in light of these developments of this kind of massive industrial parks, the integrated nickel production units, maybe I need to revise this already, but because I'm really talking about mine site. I'm really talking about digging up ore from the ground, or I think the same thing can apply to other extractive commodities. Well, it applies to oil and gas a lot less for different reasons, but 100% correct. Once you start getting into having to manage large workforces and all the different skills or the different professions that are required, the different nationalities, the different sources of those workforces, it's changing the character of the industry. Is it changing the character of the industry, or are we really just seeing sort of two industries, the mining, the extraction of the ore, and then the manufacturing and processing? These are two very different things, because in the case of Weda Bay, Morowali, indeed in the case of projects that are proposed in New South Wales have a similar kind of thing for rare earth production, where they're co-locating the refineries with the mines. That really does, it takes on more of a character of that manufacturing capital, the industrial capital, right? So yeah, I think you're 100% correct. And I think you and Tricia and some other people are sort of the experts in this now. So yeah, really agree.
Fascinating. Okay, so I have Woody and then Greg and then Sita. Maybe we'll take it all together.
Yeah.
Is that okay? Would you prefer that?
Yeah, that's good. Let me try and write some
And you can
notes
write
as
down,
we
If you wanted to sit down, it's like kind of whatever you want to do. Okay, but Woody.
Thank you. My name is researcher, economist at the Robert School.
And director of the Indonesia project. Organizes this with us.
So it seems to me that what you're going to argue is this community within all this conflict, that community is important to be in the picture. It's not about state and corporate, but it's about community and international. However, I thought that it is easy to mention community, but in the field, when this mining is happening, very difficult to define what is it exactly the community in the mining area. Because when there is a region that has been stated there is potential mining, a lot of people moving, and there is a term that we call it land claim,
Yeah.
guys. So when the mining company comes, they're going to claim, and also there is a dynamic of elite capture within this area, and so I guess many corporate actually turn out to the government because it's just too difficult to define what community. And so a lot of your, because it seems to me that you fail to define exactly what happened within the dynamic on defining community, then you could not see that actually those state, international state and community are just related. You cannot just separate it, but yeah.
Thanks. Okay, so that's one. Greg Keeley.
Greg Keeley from Political Social Change here. And I wanted to ask, perhaps it's a left field question, but in the last 4 months, the government has made available to religious organisations, large religious organisations, permits to develop mines. And I'm wondering if there is any precedent for this that you're aware of elsewhere in the world. That's the first question. The second question is, what might those mines, how might you conceptualise their relationship to the states and to private capital? Because we're all presuming that large amounts of capital are going to be needed to develop these mines, and particularly do so quickly. So what kind of anomalies are created by the system? And I suppose ultimately they're very small in the national scale of things, but still it seems an interesting, if not risk-filled experiment.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. And then Sita.
Thank you for your talk, very interesting. I'm most interested in the, you mentioned a bit about sort of the resistance of the indigenous people. Can you talk more about it? And my question is, how would you characterize it? Is it a more, does it look like a grassroots initiative kind of resistance, or was it mostly influenced or dominated by, international alliance or local NGOs and stuff?
In that particular case, or some of the other cases, or what do you think?
Well,
Generally, yeah. Okay. And Sita's one of our PhD students at the Department of Political and Social Change. I'll introduce you.
Oh, great.
Okay. Do you want me to stand up with the camera?
Yeah.
Stand that up? Yeah, there you go. I told you to sit, do whatever you wanted, but apparently you can't.
I can't stand in that. So, good? Okay.
Yeah, we are good to go in 5, 4.
Pak Budi, thank you. Yeah, good. Really good, important questions. First of all, I don't argue that it's only about communities and not state and capital, but it's about having an analysis that can encapsulate the dynamics and relationships between state, capital, community. Your questions about what really are local communities, how can they be defined? Yeah, of course, these are political questions, and these are very difficult questions to answer a lot of the time. And the very fact that a mine arrives and is established will create all these different contestations around who can be included as local, particularly of course when community development funding, when money is involved. So, and in fact, one of the cases that I talked about in this, the one of NHM in Halmahera, there's the Gossamun gold mine owned by the Newcrest, or formerly owned by Newcrest. When they were established, the mine, I think it's in the book. We can check the details. You can fact check me with my own previous facts later. But I think they started production just before that so-called ethnic religious violence in Halmahera in North Maluku broke out, and at least some of that was, well, it was mostly about distributions of resources during the process of decentralization, right? And the mine influenced that. because because everyone assumed that who was in that, the kabupaten that's closest to the mine was going to receive the lion's share of the community development funding, right? Now, Newcrest or NHM, the subsidiary, the Indonesian subsidiary, said, actually, no, we're going to define. So they said, we're not going to play into that. They didn't, of course, stop the conflict because that continued for, many other reasons that quickly got out of control. But following that conflict, NHM said, we are actually going to include in our definition of local 52 villages across six districts, Kabupaten, if I'm not, or six, yeah. We can
No
we
one
can
else
fact check
is
you.
gonna know more
We
than
can
you.
fact check me.
Don't
I should
worry.
just bluff my way through, right?
No,
No.
that's the answer to that number.
But they so which was a really interesting decision because that means that they were providing development funding resources that we use to build roads, mosques, churches, plantations across a very wide area that went much beyond the people that were the farmers and the fishers that were directly impacted by the pollution from the mine. So that raises some question, and then so then there was a sort of secondary tension within those communities because the people that were directly impacted that saw their fish stocks depleted were saying, oh, actually, we want more compensation than everyone else. But Newcrest was making this real effort to not be seen as playing like religious or ethnic favoritism in a very volatile situation. So that process of defining, and there was, so the Bull Party was involved in that situation in those campaigns as well. So you see, elites coming in, defining who is local, defining who is indigenous, right? Because I mentioned there the Pagu Isam people, some people say the Tabelo people, right? They organize through Aman. They organize internationally. So they've been to conferences in the Philippines for international indigenous peoples organizing. So who counts as indigenous, and does indigenous trump being local? All of these things all in the mix. And it's not straightforward. So so there's a case study that digs deep into that. What do we have next, Greg? Yeah, look, sorry, I did preface this by saying I haven't followed developments very closely. Look, this granting of concessions or licenses, I guess is the word, to religious organizations. We were talking about it last night, so
or to community organizations of any sort internationally? Is there
I'm sure there must be. It's not coming to the top of my mind right now, but
probably not beyond community like co-ops and indigenous communities. I can't imagine religious organizations of that type, but
look, I wouldn't be surprised if we went back in history. I wouldn't be surprised if we found something in like the gold rushes of something like that, in the West Australia or California or something. I'm not surprised. Eli might have.
There are a couple of places
There we go.
where there are mandated equity stakes
Right.
for specifically identified groups. The BEE policy in South Africa is probably the most famous because
Right.
companies must have, and that affects like governments. But in terms of for religious reasons, I've certainly never heard of an example.
or whole licenses?
Or whole
Or
licenses,
yeah.
no. You might find that there are cases in the US where Native American tribal corporations will
Indigenous
hold
groups,
concessions, but they're not awarded them on the basis of being Native American tribal groups. They hold them in as a whole factor.
Some things. There's a couple in the Northern Territory as well with equity stakes of Aboriginal
In the case of
corporations.
South Africa, it's a mandated policy. In the case of, I know the Navajo Nation owns some coal mining operations, but they own that through their tribal corporation, not as a result of being the Navajo Nation.
Yeah. So what's the second part, Greg? Sorry, about what's the relationship with the state? I don't know.
Well, you're talking about vertical, horizontal integration. So in actual fact, what happens with we don't know. It might never be developed. But, potentially what you do is integrate into that current state model, perhaps the hegemonic model. You integrate community organisations. So the idea is that this gives them long-term source of income that allows them to develop, blah, blah, blah. But in actual fact, what happens in political economy terms is you integrate them into yourself.
Yeah.
Sort of state-controlled sector. I suppose that's a speculative question.
Yeah, I think we could speculate something like that. And if it depends on what commodity it is as well. If we're talking about nickel, I don't know what commodities these licenses have applied to. I haven't followed it.
Coal.
Mainly coal. Well, then, yeah, coal can be sort of dug up and moved around and sold to whoever. It's not as vertically integrated as if it was nickel, and we're talking about many different mining licenses that would all have to feed into a refinery or processing plants. And so yeah, I would look to the sort of characteristics based on the necessity of the mineral, processing techniques and available technologies as that's my speculation, but yeah, interesting. Let's follow that and see what happens.
We're going to take a couple of questions
Sita.
online as well. So after you see it, just we have some time.
Okay, great. Yes, yeah, please, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, we just got one question. Okay, don't worry, relax. Oh, but then
We're going to see that on subaltern resistance, and particularly the question of if we see grassroots resistance, if we see elites being involved, or if it's yeah. At least in the three cases. So the sort of evolution of the Kellyanne case that I described, I saw them all starting from the grassroots, for lack of a better term, grassroots level, from the grievances of people who were dispossessed. But then in that Kellyanne case, as Rio Tinto started negotiating, and this also goes back again to Pak Budi's question earlier, that all these other opportunists come in and they say, oh yeah, I was human rights abused, I want some money, I want some compensation, and they make up these claims as well, right? So so at least in all these cases, I've seen it start from a genuine people who have grievances, and usually then growing in a way through regional, national, international alliances with different NGOs.
That's actually usually the end goal of their network.
There might be different goals amongst different actors, right? So probably compensation is quite nice for people who are potentially otherwise subsistence farmers or fishers, or people who have lost economic resources. Probably that compensation is attractive. Perhaps other NGOs who are involved, like I know, Jatam and Walhi were very unhappy with the compensation that was paid, both because it was too little, but also because they wanted to pursue the formal justice process through the court system, right? They wanted justice because that's the type of NGOs and the type of ideology that they have. They believe in things like human dignity.
we've got two.
Can I just ask a follow-on question though?
Okay, sure, yeah, and then we'll try and get to our online.
Like, how do you distinguish between what's grassroots and what's not? What's as people say, because I've not been to Kellyanne, but I've been to Illawarra and stuff that were I've been to Gosselong.
Yeah.
I would argue that in those two cases, it wasn't really grassroots. It was actually police, shall we say, who were posing as locals. And certainly the dispossession that occurs, is it truly dispossession? I mean, in the case of Illawarra, I talked to the local gold miners, none of them are local. Like I would say 5% were actually local, and the rest are from Java. They'd come in, and as the mining company came in and started putting in exploration roads, that's when they actually arrived, because they have actual access into the area.
Yeah.
So are they really being dispossessed by the mining company? I would argue in those two cases, no.
Yeah.
So how do you distinguish that?
It's going to be different in every case, right? There's differences in every case. In the case of Kellyanne, yeah, 100%. Those people were there. They had been mining. Were they indigenous people in the sense that they were, Bahau Dayak people who had been there for hundreds of thousands of years? Probably not. There was lots of people that had been there since Nam Lima, right? And they'd been mining, panning for gold since then. So yeah, they were dispossessed of their livelihoods. And in the case of Gosawong, of course, that actual mining area was forest area. The there's some debates and claims made about how much people were using that forest and how much that forest products actually was if there were people, how much people were using that forest before Newcrest NHM arrived. So was there a disposition there? Those Pagu people argue that that was their traditional land, whether they were actively using it or not, and the fishers, and they argue that there's that their fish stock was impacted, so they argue that they're dispossessed. So it's different in every case. In the case of people coming into mine sites as mines are developing, yeah, that happens. Should they be entitled to compensation? Well, probably not for the dispossession, but they probably also shouldn't be. They probably shouldn't also be like violently evicted in ways that violate human rights. So it's different in every case. I don't necessarily see it as I don't see myself as an arbiter of that kind of thing, right? Like it's interesting to think about the pressures and the movements and where claims come from, but I don't see myself as trying to adjudicate between those types of claims. It's more about how they organize and scale up that I'm interested in, and how they impact on broader political dynamics. So explaining things like the evolution of global governance and the evolution of Indonesian politics. In the Kellyanne case, really quickly, there was a process of verification that was overseen by, again, I can fact check myself, but I can't remember if Komnas HAM was involved in the process of verification, but there were some thousands of people, who put up their hands and said, yeah, I was abused, I want my compensation. And they went through interviews, through interviewing, village heads and other, Kepala Adat and things like that. Was this person around at the time? So it wasn't based on if they really were human, if they had really suffered violence. So it wasn't like eyewitness accounts, but it was just like, was this person around at that time, or are they a complete blow-in 10 years later, So there was a process of verification. It was more about verifying if there was a claim to be made.
I think you have 1 minute for one online question. Sorry.
Thank you. There is one interesting question from GMB. The question is, what is the root reason for the Western company exit, and how the exit shed implication on the ownership structure of mines in the new nickel era?
So what was the root cause of the mass exit of those Western companies?
Yeah, I think he's probably best placed to actually talk about it. But the root cause is the resource nationalist provisions. The root cause of resource nationalism is the machinations and maneuvers between domestic business elites, oligarchs, if you will, how they organize in their own interest to continue to accumulate economic wealth. Western multinational corporations, when with the exception of Freeport, when faced with the decision that you have to divest 51% plus of your shareholding or leave, almost all of them have said we'd prefer to leave. And my argument about firm strategy there is more that those strategies influence that decision. So they didn't leave because they were horizontally integrated. They didn't leave because they were didn't want to be exposed to the risk of social environmental conflicts, but they influenced that decision making, that on balance, faced with having to divest or build smelters, they left.
Yeah, that's good. I think we're actually on time. You've still got. Oh no, only 5 minutes. I'm looking at the wrong one.
Okay. Oh yeah.
The wrong one. So there was one more, and then I'll come back to you. Yeah, one more. Sorry, I took the question on time.
From Alfredo Putrawijoyo, he says, excellent presentation, and he can't wait to read the book. And the question is, have you seen any sort of interaction, contestation, or otherwise between two existing green or land grabs in Indonesia, leaving things alone, for example, REDD plus, and mineral intensive green transition, like the nickel extraction?
Competing land grabs?
Yeah,
Would be-
it's sort of interaction or contestation between two existing green or land grabs in Indonesia.
Contestation between green land grabs and extractive land grabs, is it?
Yeah, for example, like REDD plus.
Oh, right. So, yeah.
Oh, right.
So the land, like, yeah, carving out
Yeah,
land
yeah.
that the forests that
Yeah.
can't touch.
I haven't looked at that directly, but I know there is some very interesting work on it. Of course, there's overlapping and competing claims. When I was at I did a quick internship at the Agrarian Resource Centre Bandung, and the head of that centre, Dianto Bakriadi, had done this really interesting work trying to count up all the mining licenses across Indonesia, and found that the total area that had been licensed, you probably know this, had been licensed to mining, was greater than the total land area of Indonesia in terms of square kilometers. So yeah, there's competing overlapping claims in mining at least, and I assume in other sectors it's quite similar. I didn't answer the previous question about the implications of the Western multinational mining companies exit for the nickel industry.
Yeah.
Well, they mostly, with the exception of Vale, which I do class as a Western, even though it's from a BRICS country, Western multinational company, because they pursue similar strategies and they're, global diversified-ish entity. Yeah, the implications are that the implications of the more interesting story there is about Chinese capital coming in. Right? Because they, like I said, they have very different strategies for what they need to get, very different cost structures, very different technology that's available, very different integration. They're much more concerned with supply than they are with the type of low volume, low cost, high volume production of the BHP or Rio Tinto or so on. So yeah. I'm not sure if I would say that because there's not that much of an overlapping period, right? With the exception again of Vale, that the Western multinational corporations mainly exited before this boom in nickel really took off. Again.
And there weren't a lot of big, other than Vale, there were no other big multinationals. Eramet, that's it. Like they're doing a lot of nickel mining before. Chinese ones.
Yeah, sure. As you're on non-Indonesian, so I'll ask a mining question.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if we could start sort of theorizing a bit on how changes in corporate finance affect the ability or even the need of companies to engage in these sorts of integrative participatory systems. So obviously in Indonesia now, many of these coal mining operations have reasonably high levels of state backing. This is something we talked about earlier with more and more of these operations moving out of the hands of public disclosure and public accountability. So how do you theorize very quickly on how that might affect the need for companies to involve communities and whether they'll continue to do so for other reasons?
Oh, yeah, okay, that's an interesting question, and how those changes might affect the need to engage with local communities. We're certainly seeing different types, sorry, I was a little bit tangential, but we're certainly seeing different types of I said the theory is about supervising and creating forms of social reproduction that are not threatening to extractive activities. That can be done in many different ways. The Western multinational corporations were embracing more and more participation, not as some kind of like woke capitalism or some kind of like ethicalness, but doing it because they saw that as the most efficient way of managing risk of disruption to their activities, right? Of course, the models that are being used in the nickel industry now are incredibly different, and Renee and Tricia are much more expert in that than I am. And in terms of what it means for coal, do you mean in Australia or Indonesia?
I mean, you can talk globally if you want about just, you can hypothesize in Australia about how different corporate finance structures might affect the need of companies to engage in community.
Well, so, yeah, I
Doesn't
mean,
need to be.
under the boom in critical minerals in Australia, under terms of financing that are available in Australia, particularly when they involve government financing, when they involve government incentives, there are higher requirements to engage communities. That's not coal, obviously. Coal is moving the opposite direction. So in the same way that there's a downstream evolution of the mining industry in Indonesia, there is in Australia too, as mining companies are moving more towards, well, coal is toxic. Everyone's trying to get out of coal. BHP is almost out of coal. Rio Tinto is out of coal. BHP sold its oil and gas to Woodside. So the companies that are moving into coal, including Indonesian investors in Australia, I think, I don't know yet, but my suspicion is that they're going to have much less accountability, transparency, community engagement, participation, so on and so forth. Whether they will start to implement that, I don't know. MMG is a fascinating example, right? Because MMG being a Chinese-owned company that's also listed on the ASX that has adopted this participatory capitalism. They're one of the nicest mining companies. You know, they quit their membership of Minerals Council of Australia because Minerals Council of Australia were too right-wing and combative. So, you know, we have to be really careful drawing stereotypes about the national origins of capital, but perhaps we can see some patterns. Sorry.
Oh, Woody, do you want a follow-up question? Yes.
Yeah, this one. I just want to ask your opinion related to this participation on the case of illegal mining and artificial. It seems to me that several of the large companies actually allowing those illegal miners to operate surrounding their area, particularly to softening community action to them. And they also got some benefit because they actually accept. So would you be acceptable with this kind of strategy as long as they are operating in relatively safe? But a lot of companies actually to softening of community pressure is by allowing artisanal mining.
Yeah. What type of, are we talking about nickel or gold?
Mineral, you cannot do that on gas and oil.
Yeah.
But yeah, so coal is particularly 50% of, for example, in Sawalunto. Yeah, it is 50% of the size is 50% of the formal. So it's a big, and it is a lot of villages, and they're not hiding. You know, they're not hiding.
Yeah.
They pile the coal on the street, on the side of the street.
For the company to then pick up.
They just sell it anywhere, whatever.
Anywhere, not to the company.
Yeah, not just the company. But that's making the situation in the area stable.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. I don't know enough to have opinions on that, or to have any informed opinions on that, but it sounds like a really interesting case. Yeah, if those artisanal, small, illegal miners are providing stability, I mean, it's certainly going to be a source of income. You know, is that source of income, you know, alternate to them protesting or otherwise trying to extract resources? Is that why it provides stability?
Yeah, basically they actually enjoy the activity.
Okay.
Yeah, and they are actually guided. They know the area, the new area that the company is going.
Yeah.
They know that close by will be have also those kind of resources.
Don't worry about the environmental impact. So
Yeah,
illegal mining.
Yeah.
Rini, did you want to ask another question?
Yeah, I guess that is really just following up with Budi and also assistance, I guess. In geography literature, we talk about extractivism of the poor. It means that actually communities, the artisanal miners, they also actually doing extractivism at some point because the state or the government has, really present on the ground. So it's a like liquid, right? And whether companies then actually getting benefit of that illegal activities, yes, that's true. And usually companies allow these activities because even for businesses, when I ask them why, because they always say batu bara, it means barang Tuhan bagi rata. What's that in English? Yeah, it's God's resources.
Let's share it.
Let's share.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yes, please.
And it's actually also linked to this slide as well.
Oh.
Yeah, actually following up on what Barini and Pak Budi said, I keep contemplating, probably you can add one more components there. For example, whether extractive capitalisms allow for redistributive justice. Probably it's not result in justice in the absolute meaning, but redistributive justice. When everyone feels just, just because they got the God's goods, and then they share the spoils together and live happily together forever and after. Yeah, so I think the component of justice need probably further clarity and how it's signposting to extractive capitalisms.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of comes into some of those definitions about extractivism, right? Where particularly when you have the South American variants of the new extractivism, which was about state developmental strategies to take some of those profits of the multinational corporations and use it to finance broader social programs, which is redistributive justice, which is a similar thing to what I was talking about in Hamahera earlier, where they provide all these social programs financed by extractive industries, but the exact people that are suffering from pollution, dispossession, or notwithstanding earlier questioning, so that there's very differentiated impacts.
If it is directed by the state, it might have better outcome.
No, not at all. No, I would never be so brave. And there, in some situations, depending on the coalition that has created some types of resource nationalism, there's those resources that are captured by the state could be used in different ways, right? So in the left wing, post-neoliberal pink-tide South American states, which have largely gone out of fashion again now, was to finance the broad-based centre-left social democratic project, right? In Indonesia, that wasn't the case, right? No, of course. So,
and we made one or two best practices around the world.
Sorry?
Is there a best practice around the world about extractive industry?
Australia.
Well,
Here is being recorded.
Yeah. It's a good question, because you've sort of worked with mining companies as well as worked with communities who oppose mining companies. You must, in Australia, Indonesia. Where do you sort of see there being an ideal kind of distributed model? And of course, you read a lot about the Latin American case as well.
Yeah. It varies so much. It varies so much between national contexts within countries, right? So, there's been lots of talk in Australia about Indonesian nickel being, dirty, unclean, flooding the market. And, frankly, I think this is kind of, it plays on racist ideas about, sort of what production looks like in Asia and in Indonesia. And I think, Rini, I think you've made a similar point as well about Australian nickel miners using this type of language. yeah, okay, most of that nickel production is a lot higher in carbon intensity, but there's a lot of variance as well, right? Within the nickel industry within Indonesia, just like there's a lot of variance within the nickel industry in Australia, or those that are still surviving. So lots of variance, and depends on what measure we talk about. You know, the Europeans are much more concerned with carbon intensity. So therefore, they would have really liked the Nickel West operations from WA, where BHP was building solar panels to power their mines and, you know, focusing on reducing the embedded carbon within nickel. The Europeans would have preferred that. The Americans prefer a stable supply. So they, might have other considerations. So how we evaluate these things is really different, really difficult. I'm not brave to say who does it best, because there's so much variance. Yeah.
And just a quick point on that, the discourse in Australia is based on an amnesic view of West Australian nickel industry, which is, if you go back through history, like to be clear, it's an open industry. It has been for many years. It has very short run periods where its marginal costs are valuable. But if you go back to 2007, Norilsk invested in WA for about $10 billion and brought it down to $30 billion. That was. And that was all in nickel projects, and Norilsk eventually left all their international investments in one project. There has been a long history in WA of failed projects for exactly this reason.
Yeah.
But that's like there's a misplaced there's an idea in Australia that the resources sector is always competitive, mostly because the iron ore sector is.
And it's always clean and ethical.
It's always clean and ethical. The WA nickel sector isn't really that competitive on a global cost curve.
But there certainly are projects that are better than others.
So it's a project level rather than sort of state level question in some ways.
I think so.
Okay.
I think so.
Unless anyone wants to have the last word, I think that we've brought this session to a close. I can tell from all the questions and people asking questions again and again that this was a truly fascinating presentation, fascinating book. Here it is, and to be in paperback as well, I think.
Paperback soon.
Yeah.
I do have some flyers there.
There.
Can I say something off recording?
Yes.
Don't. If anyone's thinking about it,